Abigail Adams was a brilliant woman and a founding mother who became one of the most influential first ladies in American history. Abigail Adams, wife of the second United States President, was born in Weymouth, Massachusetts on November 22, 1744. She came from a prominent New England family. She had a sharp intellect and independent spirit. Abigail's education was unusual for women of her time. She was taught at home by her parents and grandmother, developing a love of reading and learning that would last her entire life. Young Abigail devoured books from her father's extensive library, educating herself in literature, philosophy, and politics. She read Shakespeare, Milton, and the great thinkers of the Enlightenment. This self-education gave her insights that few women of her era possessed. In 1764, at the age of 19, Abigail Smith married John Adams, a young lawyer from Braintree, Massachusetts. John Adams was ambitious and passionate about the law and politics. Their marriage would become one of the great partnerships in American history. Abigail and John shared a deep intellectual connection. They discussed politics, philosophy, and the events of their turbulent times as equals. This was highly unusual in an era when women were expected to defer to their husbands in all matters. Within a year of their marriage, Abigail gave birth to the first of their 5 children. She would raise their children largely alone as John's political career took him away from home for months and years at a time. The 1770s brought tremendous upheaval to the American colonies. Britain was tightening its control and imposing new taxes on the colonists. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, and other measures inflamed colonial resentment. John Adams became increasingly involved in the Patriot cause, defending colonial rights against British tyranny. Abigail supported her husband's political activities completely. She managed their farm in Braintree, raised their children, and kept the household running while John attended meetings and congresses in Boston and Philadelphia. Abigail Adams was not merely a supportive wife waiting at home. She was an active participant in the revolutionary cause, sharing her opinions freely with her husband and other political leaders. In 1774, John Adams was elected as a delegate to the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. He would spend the next decade away from home more often than not, serving his country in Congress and diplomatic missions abroad. Abigail remained in Massachusetts, managing the family farm and finances with remarkable skill. She bought and sold goods, managed hired help, and made important business decisions. She proved herself an astute businesswoman and capable manager. During these long separations, Abigail and John maintained their connection through letters. They wrote to each other constantly, sometimes multiple times per week. These letters reveal Abigail's brilliant mind and her influence on her husband's thinking. Abigail Adams's letters are among the most important documents of the Revolutionary era. She wrote with wit, intelligence, and passion about the great events unfolding around her. She described life in wartime Massachusetts, the hardships faced by ordinary people, and her own struggles to keep the family afloat. But she also wrote about politics and government, offering her opinions on how the new nation should be structured. In March 1776, as the Continental Congress debated independence, Abigail wrote her most famous letter to John. She urged him and his colleagues to remember the ladies when creating laws for the new nation. She argued that women deserved legal protections and should not be subject to the unlimited power of their husbands. This was a radical idea for 1776. Abigail Adams was ahead of her time in her views on women's rights and education. She believed women were intellectually equal to men and deserved the same educational opportunities. She lamented that girls were denied formal schooling and urged that the new republic provide education for both sexes. While she never advocated for women's suffrage explicitly, her letters show she believed women should have a voice in government. She understood that true liberty required protecting the rights of all people, not just propertied white men. Her husband John respected her opinions, though he gently mocked her suggestion about remembering the ladies. Still, Abigail's influence on John's thinking was profound and lasting. The Revolutionary War brought danger and hardship to Massachusetts. British troops occupied Boston, and the Battle of Bunker Hill was fought within earshot of the Adams farm. Abigail witnessed the aftermath of battle, caring for wounded soldiers and refugees. She described the horrors of war in vivid letters to John. She also dealt with shortages of food and supplies, inflation, and the constant worry about her husband's safety. In 1776, a smallpox epidemic swept through New England. Abigail made the brave decision to have herself and her children inoculated against the disease. Inoculation was controversial and dangerous, but Abigail understood the science and took the calculated risk. All survived the procedure. In 1778, John Adams was appointed as a diplomatic representative to France. He sailed for Europe, taking their 10-year-old son John Quincy with him. Abigail remained in Massachusetts with the other children, not seeing her husband for nearly 4 years. These were difficult years for Abigail. She missed John terribly and worried constantly about his safety crossing the Atlantic and navigating the dangers of European politics. She continued managing the farm and family finances, making investments and business decisions that increased their wealth. She also continued her correspondence with John, offering advice on diplomatic matters and American foreign policy. Her letters reveal a sophisticated understanding of international relations and European politics. In 1784, Abigail finally joined John in Europe. She sailed to London and then traveled to Paris, where John was serving as American minister to France. Abigail was 40 years old and had never been more than a few miles from Massachusetts. The journey was arduous and frightening, but she was determined to reunite with her husband and son. Abigail spent the next 4 years in Europe, first in France and then in London when John became the first American minister to Great Britain. She found European society fascinating and troubling. She admired European art and culture but was appalled by the poverty and inequality she witnessed. She wrote detailed letters describing French and English society, politics, and customs. Abigail Adams served as an unofficial diplomat during her years in Europe. She hosted dinners and receptions, cultivating relationships with European political figures and their wives. She charmed French and British officials while remaining fiercely loyal to American interests. She defended American democracy against European skeptics who believed the new republic would fail. She also gathered intelligence and political information, passing it along to John and other American officials. Abigail was particularly effective at learning information from the wives and daughters of European politicians, who spoke more freely to her than they would to male diplomats. In 1788, John and Abigail returned to America. The Constitution had been ratified, and George Washington was about to be inaugurated as the first president. John Adams was elected as the first vice president, receiving the second highest number of electoral votes. The Adams family moved to New York City, then the nation's capital. As the vice president's wife, Abigail had no official role or title. The position of second lady had no precedent or defined duties. Abigail created the role herself, hosting dinners and receptions and supporting her husband's work. She also continued to advise John on political matters, reading newspapers and pamphlets and discussing policy with him. John Adams found the vice presidency frustrating. He had little real power and often disagreed with Washington's policies. Abigail shared his frustrations but counseled patience. She understood that the new government was an experiment and that establishing precedents was crucial. When the capital moved to Philadelphia in 1790, Abigail divided her time between Philadelphia and the family home in Massachusetts. She disliked being separated from John but needed to manage their property and finances. She also struggled with poor health, suffering from rheumatism and other ailments. Despite her physical difficulties, she remained active and engaged in politics. In 1796, George Washington announced he would not seek a third term as president. John Adams ran for president against Thomas Jefferson. The election was bitter and divisive, splitting the young nation along partisan lines. John Adams won by a narrow margin, becoming the second president of the United States. Thomas Jefferson, as the runner-up, became vice president. This created an awkward situation, as Adams and Jefferson belonged to opposing political parties and disagreed on fundamental issues. Abigail Adams became First Lady in March 1797. She took on the role with characteristic intelligence and energy. Abigail Adams redefined what it meant to be First Lady. Martha Washington had set a precedent of dignified reserve and social grace. Abigail maintained that dignity but added a new dimension of political engagement. She attended congressional debates and presidential meetings. She read newspapers voraciously and discussed policy with her husband and other political leaders. She offered John advice on appointments, legislation, and foreign policy. Her influence was so well known that political opponents called her Mrs. President and accused her of exercising undue influence over her husband. Abigail was unapologetic about her involvement in politics. The Adams presidency was tumultuous from the start. The nation was divided between Federalists who supported a strong central government and Republicans who favored states' rights. Foreign policy dominated the administration as America struggled to maintain neutrality between warring France and Britain. The quasi-war with France brought the nation to the brink of full-scale conflict. Abigail supported John's efforts to avoid war while defending American interests. She believed in diplomacy and negotiation but also understood that the young nation needed to project strength. She counseled John to stand firm against French provocations while seeking peaceful resolution. In 1798, Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, controversial laws that restricted immigration and criminalized criticism of the government. John Adams signed these acts into law, believing they were necessary to protect national security. Abigail strongly supported the Sedition Act, arguing that newspapers that published lies and slander about the president should be punished. This was one area where Abigail's views seem harsh by modern standards. She believed that criticism of the government during wartime was dangerous and unpatriotic. She failed to see how these laws violated the First Amendment principles of free speech and free press that she otherwise supported. In 1800, the federal government moved from Philadelphia to the new capital city of Washington. Abigail and John moved into the unfinished president's house, later called the White House. The building was cold, drafty, and incomplete. Abigail famously hung laundry to dry in the unfinished East Room. She found Washington a miserable swamp town, hot and humid in summer and muddy and uncomfortable year-round. Despite these hardships, Abigail fulfilled her duties as First Lady, hosting receptions and dinners in the incomplete mansion. She remained actively involved in politics during the final months of John's presidency. The election of 1800 was even more bitter than the election of 1796. John Adams ran for re-election against Thomas Jefferson. The campaign was vicious, with newspapers on both sides publishing attacks and slanders. Abigail was deeply hurt by the personal attacks on John's character and abilities. She believed her husband was being treated unfairly and that his accomplishments were being ignored. In the end, Thomas Jefferson won the election. John Adams became the first president to lose re-election. He was devastated by the defeat, and Abigail shared his disappointment. They left Washington before Jefferson's inauguration, returning to their home in Massachusetts. Retirement brought both relief and sadness to Abigail and John Adams. They were finally able to live together permanently after decades of separation. They settled into their home in Quincy, Massachusetts, formerly called Braintree. Abigail managed the household and their financial affairs while John read and wrote. They received visitors and corresponded with friends and family. Abigail continued to follow politics closely, reading newspapers and discussing current events. She was particularly proud when their son John Quincy Adams was appointed as a diplomat and later as senator. She lived to see John Quincy become a major political figure in his own right. Abigail Adams's health declined in her later years. She suffered from rheumatism, fevers, and other ailments. Despite her physical difficulties, she remained mentally sharp and engaged with the world around her. She continued to write letters, though not as prolifically as during her younger years. She maintained her interest in politics and current events. She also reconciled with Thomas Jefferson, who renewed his friendship with John Adams after years of estrangement. Abigail was initially reluctant to forgive Jefferson, but eventually she accepted the reconciliation. The correspondence between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson in their final years became famous as a testament to their shared history. On October 28, 1818, Abigail Adams died of typhoid fever at the age of 73. John Adams was devastated by her death. He survived her by 8 years, dying on July 4, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Abigail Adams left behind a remarkable legacy. Her letters provide invaluable insights into the founding era and the daily life of the revolutionary generation. She was a witness to and participant in the creation of the American Republic. She influenced her husband's thinking on numerous political issues and helped shape his presidency. She expanded the role of First Lady beyond mere social hostess to include political advisor and public figure. Abigail Adams was a champion of women's education and women's rights long before these became mainstream causes. She believed in the intellectual equality of women and argued that women deserved legal protections and educational opportunities. While limited by the conventions of her time, she pushed boundaries and challenged assumptions about women's proper role in society. She proved through her own example that women could be intelligent political thinkers and capable managers. She raised children who became leaders, including a president. She managed complex financial affairs successfully. She served as an effective diplomat and political advisor. She did all this while maintaining her marriage and family relationships. Abigail Adams also had her flaws and limitations. She supported the Sedition Act and believed government critics should be silenced. She shared the racial prejudices common in her time, though she opposed slavery and believed it contradicted American principles of liberty. She could be judgmental and sharp-tongued in her assessments of others. She sometimes let her fierce loyalty to John cloud her judgment about political opponents. But these flaws make her more human and relatable, not less admirable. She was a woman of her time who nonetheless transcended many of the limitations placed on women in the 18th century. Today, Abigail Adams is remembered as one of the most remarkable women in American history. She was a founding mother whose contributions to the American Revolution and early republic were substantial and lasting. Her letters are studied by historians and students as primary sources for understanding the Revolutionary era. Her advocacy for women's rights and education presaged the women's movement of later centuries. Her partnership with John Adams demonstrated that marriage could be a relationship of intellectual equals. Her example as First Lady influenced subsequent presidential wives and expanded the possibilities of that role. Abigail Adams was a woman of extraordinary intelligence, courage, and principle who helped shape the American nation.